2,000 years later, 612 hours later, a few inches later, day 2.
Три дня спустя. 2000 лет спустя. 6,5.
2,000 years later. 6.5 hours later. A few inches later. Day 2, day 3, day 4. A few moments later. One a while later. Many miles later. The next day. 1 week later. One bus ride later. The next morning. Many exam questions later. The next morning. Many hours later. 2 minutes later. Several hours later. Several thousand ripped pants later. 1 hour later. Several months later. 200 whoopsies later. 6 stinky months later. Several weeks later. Later that night. In me, it is starting to get very annoying. 3,000 whoop-whoos later. Soon after. Later. Moments later. The next morning. Many unbearable hours later. 82 kilometers later. A little later. 3 hours later. 1 season later. Many secret parties later. Moments later. 1 nap later. 1 very long digestive tract later. 6 months later. 1 pathetic sob story later. Later. Yesterday, meanwhile, at the Krusty Krab. Meanwhile, back in the lowlands, later, 12 seconds later, 1 minute, 37 seconds later, 2 very boring minutes later, a few minutes later, a little longer than a few minutes later, 5 minutes later, 5 minutes later, 5 minutes later, 11 minutes later, 15 minutes later. 20 minutes later. Many minutes later. 1. What follows is a brief construction montage. Late again.
Limited time only.
Flashback. And a flashback. Soon after. Montage. Yesterday. Meanwhile, back in the lowland. Meanwhile, at the Krusty Krab. A few moments later. Moments later. Moments later. Moments later. More moments later.
Later.
Later. Later. Later. Later.